Fantastic. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. For decades, institutions like Cambridge, institutions like Yale, and a bunch of other random white ones in the US and Canada and the UK have benefited explicitly off of the brain drain that occurs within developing countries, where the best students from these nations, because of the fact that their own education systems have been systematically disenfranchised for centuries, do not have the capacity to study there, therefore have to move to these nations. And that's where these universities gain the most amount of benefit. We think fundamentally they must be held accountable for this, and the best means of mitigating this brain drain in the future as well is to pursue the policy that stands in our name. Cool. The first thing I'm going to talk about is like what the model explicitly looks like and what we think this is probably going to translate into. We think this is probably going to be like a proportional representation of this fee. So you're probably going to have something between 10 to 13%, depending on the school and depending on its fee structure. The second thing we're going to talk about here, we think is going to happen is like most schools in this institution are likely going to be partnering up with stuff like NGOs in the instances of like if you're a university in England, for instance, and you have to send money to Pakistan, you're probably not sending it to the Pakistani government or not sending it to some random school. You're probably sending it to the TCF Foundation or institutions there that specifically are designed to propel education within those countries. Cool. That takes out about a significant portion of the mitigatory stuff that opposition is going to talk about. So then what are the institutions that we're talking about in this debate anyway? We think there's broadly two types of institutions in this debate. We think that the first type of institutions are those that operate on prestige incentives to attract international students. What we mean by this is that most countries have only a limited amount of top students, and they usually end up going to some universities, and the vast majority of universities are then denied access to that top level of student. We think that this is the instances in which those universities provide opportunities for students from other countries who are top level students to come to their universities in the first place, so they can benefit off of all of the things that come from having international students as a result of this. These look like probably looking diverse, so that more people in your country generally want to interact with that university or want to go there. But secondly, also in terms of things like having better students, therefore having better research projects, being more likely to get things like research grants and access to the material that comes from being a more prestigious academic institution. The second type of academic institution that we think is going to happen here is probably ones that are extremely profit motivated, the kind of ones that the Canadian team is probably going to refer to in this debate as well, where they have significant disparities in terms of how much they charge international students versus how much they charge local students. We think even in those instances, given that this is a small percentage of that fee rise, like most of the ratio here is like $7,000 per year to like $70,000 per year. So we think they're still going to be able to make a significant amount of profit there. So we don't think that the concern of like universities will suddenly stop accepting international students in this debate is really what this debate is essentially about. This debate is essentially about two things. Firstly, can we significantly reduce the harms of the brain drain that currently happens in developing countries, which does not allow these developing countries to economically progress beyond a certain point? And secondly, can we hold these institutions in particular responsible? Let's start with the second question first. Why are these institutions in particular responsible for the damage that's been done to these countries? Note that the vast majority of wealth that has been generated in the developed world has come at the direct expense of the developing world. This looks like processes like colonialism and also neocolonialism, where both they either went to these nations, destroyed their economic systems, like you saw what the British did to India, where they completely transformed a thriving economy into one that was no longer functional. Or it looks like processes like neocolonialism, where they significantly impose incredibly high interest loans and cap and significantly butcher the capacity for these countries to develop their own education systems, because they're stuck paying back money to these countries and therefore they're unable to invest it in their own education systems, which causes the fundamental problem of the brain drain in the first place. Given that this is the characterization, why specifically do we hold these institutions accountable? Note that these institutions have directly benefited off of the actions of their governments in the past. So as a result of the fact that people in this country no longer have access to the best level of education directly because of the harm caused by these governments, they necessarily have to turn abroad. Whether this is rich students in these nations who take their money to those for-profit universities, to denying it to the universities in their own countries, which could be able to develop from the money that they would be making off these richer students, or whether it's like good top-level students who have to migrate abroad because their own options have been made extremely limited. As a result of this, we think that fundamentally it's extremely important that we hold these people accountable. And even in the event that this is not the most effective regulation or the most effective mechanism by which we do this, we think even in those situations, having some means by which we make sure that these people owe their reparative duty, the fact that they've benefited off of exploitation, the fact that they've benefited off of choice reduction, they've benefited off of processes like colonialism, means they have to pay it back. The fact that they've benefited off of this means that irrespective of whether you believe our utile outcomes, we still have fundamentally justified in pursuing such a policy. But then why specifically do we get those utile outcomes as well? Before I go on to that, I'll take closing if you have something.
So brain drain actually often means that these individuals get a far better education than they actually anytime could have had within their own country. Don't you think that's a major benefit?
Cool. Like the whole point of here is that the brain drain happening, and the reason that they're able to get that better education is because you took away their capacity to get that better education in their own countries in the first place. They weren't able to invest in their education systems because of processes like neocolonialism and extremely high debt traps, or because you destroyed their education systems through processes like colonialism, where you took over them and turned them into subsidies for your own goddamn countries. Cool. Having characterized that, why specifically do we still get better utile outcomes on our side of the house? Look, when you have a significant amount of money being funneled back into these countries in the first place, because like note that quite a large number of students go abroad to study from like places like Pakistan, places like India, places like Bangladesh, Singapore, like half of the Cambridge debating union is from there. We think that all of that fees, when you combine it, is able to produce significantly better circumstances for people within those developing countries. What do we mean by this? Through whatever mechanism by which you get to the money, through the mechanism of NGOs getting to different schools or different universities within this region, what you're probably going to end up with is you're going to end up with a lot more schools having a lot more access to resources. We think this significantly improves the circumstances for everybody in the future who either A, cannot get into one of those universities abroad and now has a significantly better chance of having a quality education at home, but B, also make sure that people don't have to turn abroad. They don't have to abandon their houses and abandon their homes to be able to get a good education. What do we mean by a good education, and why is this particularly important? We think that more money generally looks like things like better teachers, better infrastructure, better access to resources, better books, better faculties, and also having a generally better interactive, technologically advanced system of education. As a result of all of these things, you're able to do a few things. Firstly, you're able to generate benefit for these universities in and of themselves who've been directly harmed in the past. But secondly, you're able to allow these people to fulfill their economic potential. Because even in the instances where people go abroad and benefit off of the brain drain individually, the countries that were damaged in the past do not get any of the benefits that those people do. The economic potential that they have is fulfilled in some other country. I think that in this situation, you allow a significant number of people to fulfill that economic potential within their own nations as well, because they have a greater amount of skills and a greater amount of knowledge that they can then translate into economic output, improving both the circumstances of themselves and the countries around them. Because we've already told you why the mitigatory concerns from opposition do not stand in this debate, and we've given you a principal justification in addition to utile outcomes. Please vote. Opening up.
The speaker for that speech, I now invite the Leader of Opposition. Here. The Leader of Opposition does not consent to being streamed.
just donating to NGOs, that's efficient and easier for them.
Every school.
Deputy Prime Minister, here.
All right, cool. Am I both audible and visible?
Yep, you're good to go.
Fantastic. Give me 1 sec. I'm setting up my timer. POIs in the chat, please. Coolio. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening opposition falls out of this debate, the point at which they literally choose just not to engage with our principle because, oh, what are you going to do if the whole developed world had a say in colonialism, take money off of them? That's literally not what we're saying. The simple principle that our entire case stands upon, and the reason that these wealthy institutions are specifically accountable towards all of these developing countries and specifically the students who come from those developing countries is because they have specifically benefited off of the processes that went into this. These processes, like the brain drain, are these international students directly coming to them for education because in their own countries, education is not as well developed and as good as it could be because specifically of these countries and in these particular regions, right? We think the point at which opening opposition literally doesn't engage with this, and we tell you that institutions literally have this responsibility and should be doing this, and it's the minimum that they can do. We think they've lost this debate already and haven't really proven anything, right? But first off, let's move on to a couple of their points of analysis and their case as a whole, right? Because they had two major things to say to us, right? First of all, they talked about ineffectiveness, saying that this is not going to help because this is just not an effective use of government resources, and that most universities are only going to send this to feeder schools or use this as set up feeder schools or send it to associate schools, right? Look, the simple fact of the matter is we were never against the idea of setting up feeder schools in the first place, right? Or going to giving this money to universities, right? The fact of the matter is the thing that our mechanism is able to do, and the reason that we're actually able to have benefit on our side of the house is if you have a system in place where these universities pay, say, 10% of these international student fees to NGOs, for example, this is a much more easier thing to do on our side of the house than setting up a feeder school in the first place or going and giving that type of money. We're fine with Monash Australia going and giving money to Monash Malaysia. We think that will improve education within Monash Malaysia and have more students going there in the first place and having it at the very least access to those educational institutions in the first place, right? But secondly, in terms of this idea of the government using this money badly and that we need to defend this notion of educational institutes selecting which educational institutes these go to, we think that the likely scenario with this policy being implemented would be where these universities have the easiest time investing their money. This would be in setting up feeder schools or sending money to public schools. We think that this would still improve the overall capacity for education within most of these countries, considering that most schools within these countries aren't up to par with, say, school, say private schools or even public schools within Canada, the United States, or the UK, right? We think that's the major difference that you look at over here, right? But secondly, they come in here and talk about this idea about these harms coming directly to students, right? And if we flip the stakeholder here, note we win this debate right here, not just on principle, but on utile outcomes as well, right? Because what do they say here? They come in and try to tell us that international students are directly going to be harmed as a result of this, right? That they're going to have an issue because universities are going to increase educational fees, and this is where the direct harm is going to come in, right? Mahad literally preempts this in his speech by talking to you about what most of these educational institutes look like, right? They're still more likely to take in these international students because of prestige, and secondly, they'll probably want more of these students from these countries coming in to bring that level of prestige to their university in the first place, right? But talking about in terms of these domestic students that'll be harmed by financial aid, we don't think these are the stakeholders that are likely to be affected for the simple reason that most domestic students within these countries aren't going to lose access to all of the resources they already have, for example, right? We tell you that most of these countries still have better set up systems of education than compared to, say, most of public schooling in Asia. We think they're still going to have access to a better quality of education leading up to when they literally apply to university. So they're still going to have somewhat of an access to go there and do this. Who are the most important stakeholder? Who's the most important stakeholder in this debate then, right? We tell you that what ends up happening as a result of specifically our policy is that these universities specifically set up schools within these developing countries. They're able to fund these educational institutes and actively create that change and actually pay back that harm that they've done by taking these students away, right? These universities will still maintain a level of prestige and still likely take in international students because that's not going to take away, because again, most of these universities aren't just going to be profit run. They're going to be run by wanting to dedicate time to research, wanting to have more diverse campuses, because again, these are things that sell not just within international spheres, but within domestic spheres as well. It's likely that when you are marketing your university or you're going out of your way to sell your university to someone, you're going to want a more diverse range of students on campus. So we don't see that harm accruing. But before I move on to anything else, does closing have anything for me? I'll take opening then. Nothing? Okay, cool. So moving on. Next up, in terms of if you want to debate, let's say you ignore all of our principal harm in this debate, right? And say that these institutions literally don't have any reparative reason or any sort of owing to these institutes, right? We still tell you the utile outcomes on our side of the house are still better in this situation. Why is this the case? Their only mechanism on their side of the house in terms of doing this is lowering tuition fees for international students, right? We think that just lowering tuition fees is still not going to make this extremely accessible. And more importantly, a key delta within this debate is actually paying for a lot of the damages that have been done to the education systems of these developing countries. So the likelihood is we will want a situation where there is improvements in the education system and there is at least some sort of change happening within these developing countries. That change looks like these schools getting the sort of money they get from these big sort of institutes, paying money to for teachers, for facilities, for different things, and access that these country students can get, right? Because this is the biggest part of this case, right? We don't think domestic students within these big countries are the major stakeholder here. We think international students who are coming in are the biggest stakeholder. The countries they're coming from are the major thing that you need to look at within this situation, right? Quite simply, panel, what have we shown to you in this debate, and why should opening government take a very clear first? Opposition literally refuses to engage with our principles, saying it's flimsy and taking a very generalized tone in what we talk about. We tell you these educational institutes have benefited directly. We tell you that the way this funding goes, and the way our policy is structured, it's very likely going to be easy for them to do this sort of investment in the first place and actively make these sort of changes within these developing countries because of the reparative principle that's there. And finally, on outcomes generally, we think it is more likely that international students and the countries they come from are going to benefit a lot more on our side of the house because they're actually going to be able to go out of their way to have these facilities granted to them to be there. We don't think the government corruption aspect of this debate, we think that was framed out in Mahad's speech already, and something that universities are going to find the easiest way to invest money, and that's likely giving it to NGOs that actually work on education, actually support public schooling. They literally have pointed out no major harm on our side of the house. Their biggest thing is domestic students. We think they still have access for all these reasons, and because they've literally not engaged with our principle, we take it. Give it to opening government. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for that speech. Now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Again, a reminder that they do not consent to being streamed. Whenever you're ready.
Austrian government largely rested their case on a very obscure and very vague principle, will knife themselves on many occasions. On the one hand, they said that international students are going to be far better able to get into these universities because universities are supposedly going to be taking so much more of them. On the other hand, we massively reduce access in terms of ability to get into programs, etc. We're going to be the first team to bring you clear mechanisms and clear impacts as that you could actually weigh in the round. That is to say, we think there will be a significant reduction in the number of international students arriving at these universities, and we think that is a good thing for numerous reasons that OG failed to outline other than saying brain drain was a thing. Therefore, why will there be a significant reduction in the number of people going to these Western universities in the vast majority of cases? I think like 4 reasons or so. First, insofar as you have to pay more money back towards the developing world, the opportunity cost for accepting an international student over a local student vastly increases, meaning universities have less of an incentive to take them in. Second of all, they may counteract this by increasing fees, but the point is that the point at which you increase fees, that means fewer international students are going to apply in the first place, because for those international students, the opportunity cost of applying to the West increases because they have to pay more money. Try and say, well, actually, there are always going to be enough rich international people to apply to these areas. But insofar, in many cases, we're talking about developing countries in numerous circumstances. We don't think there will be enough rich people. In fact, we think there will almost certainly always be enough rich locals, because we're talking about developed countries, than rich people. Therefore, they're probably going to be significantly more likely going to take wealthy domestic students. We think, therefore, when it comes to even the middle and upper class in developing countries, the likelihood that they go to they go to a school in the West is going to decrease. But finally, we think in many cases, there often is discrimination against students. There often is racism against students from other countries. And we think the point, although this may say the same on either side of the house, it's a reason for why universities, when given an excuse to not accept these students because the opportunity cost is higher, are almost certainly going to defer to accepting more middle class and wealthy locals. What is the result of this? I think first I'd like to respond to an extraneous point they told us about why ultimately countries in universities in the home countries of these students are always going to be inadequate due to things like political reasons that are inherent, for example, the lack of academic freedom. But we think that's only likely going to change on our side of the house. That is to say, when students are given the ability to opt out of the system altogether, they have no reason to do anything to try and change that in the long term. We think that change is more likely going to occur on our side, as opposed to on their side where they can simply cop out of the system. Therefore, what are the benefits of these international students who would have been international students staying behind? I think like 5 benefits actually. First, insofar as they are spending a large amount of money on fees in their local institutions, we think ultimately that's probably when these local universities get far more money, and therefore we probably just already at this point equal the benefits OG described. Because OG say these universities get more money because Western university will donate to them. We also achieve that same benefit by people who would have been international students spending money on fees in those local areas. But second of all, we think this is crucial, and we don't think OG actually talk about why this is so important. We have local expertise staying behind. And we think although they may not access as high quality education by staying behind as they could have gone by going abroad, the point is that insofar as they likely have incentives to remain after that education has finished, because ultimately that's probably where like the majority of employers are going to be for them, or the most proximate employers and most accessible jobs, that's probably when we're able to get huge benefits for those local countries when expertise stays behind. And the reason for this is it's a huge diminishing marginal utility. That is to say, one engineer is probably needed to a far greater extent in a developing country than in a developed one. And insofar as development often definitely requires expertise in terms of constructing industry, building infrastructure, allowing for things like basic medical benefits, on our side of the house, when you have talented people who would have used their talents in rich countries and maybe getting more money, but on our side of the house, that expertise is needed to a far greater degree. And even if they're and we think ultimately this is necessary for development, which is probably like the greatest impact in the debate. But third of all, we think they form a strong emotional connection to their local areas on our side of the house when they stay behind. That is to say, when they're studying in these local universities, we think ultimately they're far more likely going to do things like study local history. They form more of an emotional connection to their own country, not only because they're more grateful to it because they've spent a longer period of time there, but also they have greater contact with locals and people who will be middle or lower class in that particular country, which we think means they have a stronger feeling of duty towards helping that country. We think they're more likely going to do things like donate to charity, etc., and help people out and pay taxes in those areas. Yes, OO.
So there's often very, very limited spots in, for example, domestic engineering universities in developing countries because there are so few of them. International students going abroad so they can actually get the education are far more likely to move back home and use their skills because things like immigration are difficult.
Okay, yeah. I agree. Okay, first of all, I think that people are incredibly unlikely going to move back after they go to the Western country because they can earn far more money there. On our side of the house, insofar as there's like a huge degree of path dependency, and you ultimately they greater, stronger emotional connection to that country, and furthermore, the fact that most the employers are more proximate, so it's easier to find a job in your own country if you study there. We think probably they're far more likely going to stay on our side than they do on their side. And furthermore, on their side, we think ultimately, insofar as like living fees are quite high in the West, they're unlikely going to do things like send back remittances, and also just the fact that they can earn marginally more money in richer countries probably mean they're going to stay behind, but stay there. Sorry. Before the fourth of all, and we this is in response to what we just heard about. There are not enough spots in local education. First, I already told you that they're more likely going to spend money in the local education system. But insofar as we're talking about middle upper class people who tend to have quite a lot of political capital in these developing countries, on our side of the house, they have incentives to improve that system because their children are the ones who are going to be using it. On their side, they have no incentive to do anything or to use any of their capital to try and improve that because they know they're never going to have to use that system. So on our side of the house, they have to lobby for more local government funding, or they're more likely going to lobby for higher taxes to pay for that funding in order to increase the number of spaces because they have incentive to do so because they're reliant on that system. On their side of the house, they have no reason to improve the local system because they have no reason to use it. But furthermore, and this is, we think there's greater intellectual diversity when more people are staying behind. And we think we need to talk about the specific groups of people who tend to send their children abroad. And in the vast majority of cases, these do tend to be people who are most liberal because these are the kinds of people who ultimately are like most open about leaving their own culture and integrating within the Western liberal culture. We think, therefore, you have greater intellectual diversity in local institutions and the university system when people, instead of people sending their children abroad, are likely going to keep them at home. We think this is beneficial for a number of reasons. First, because in many cases there are because these people are likely going to go into positions of power in their own country because by nature of the fact that they have they've achieved a very high education in that country, and therefore they can use these things for benefits. In many cases, there are very restrictive, coercive, conservative norms that unfortunately harm groups like women, LGBTQ people, etc. We think on our side of the house, you're able to spread to a far greater extent, that is to say, as opposed to these local institutions being conservative echo chambers, at least you have a diversity of thought which allows for greater discussion, which we think ultimately is a principal goal that universities should support. Therefore, we give you clear reasons as to why students would stay behind and why we gain numerous benefits there. That on their side of the house, students will probably move abroad and stay there. On our side of the house, they stay behind. Therefore, we're proud to propose.
Thanks, Speaker, for that speech. And I now invite the member of opposition to start off closing opposition's case. Here.
By the way, my camera doesn't work for some reason, so I hope that's okay.
Yep, no worries.
Okay. Also, if you want to ask a POI, either just do it visually or just do it in the text box. Okay. I'll begin by explaining why we take the debate automatically over all teams in the debate, and then I'll briefly extend on opening opposition, specifically analyzing the harms to developing countries when there will be fewer students from developing countries now going to these Western institutions. Firstly, on opening opposition, I have two reasons why we beat them. First of all, they make analysis about how these Western institutions will mostly donate to sister or partner organizations in the developing nations. While this might be true, I think this is only marginalization of the opening and closing government case. We will explain why this policy will lead to long-term and active harms for institutions in developing countries, which takes us over OO because we take OG at their absolute best case scenario and say that some of their benefits accrue in the short term. Second of all, is though they're right when pointing out that there are benefits to the brain drain in their DLO, they never explain the exact mechanisms as to how this brain drain is stopped in the first place. By proving that significantly fewer students from developing countries will actually attend these institutions, we activate the majority of opening opposition's impacts, making their impacts reliant on our analysis. Secondly, on opening government, they bring us two broad claims. First of all, a principle about how these institutions must be held accountable for their complicity in brain drain style colonialism. I think, first of all, is these institutions already making up for their past, if this framing is actually true, by offering scholarships to a significant number of individuals from developing countries, or even opportunities to this disadvantage, either through training contracts or simply through education. Therefore, this motion is completely unnecessary at the point at which we prove that these Western institutions were doing that in the first place. But second of all, is I think this is pretty strange when you think about it critically. Look at US institutions, which have the highest proportion of students from from developing countries in the Western hemisphere. They didn't participate in colonialism, but according to opening government logic, they aren't part of the principle. But secondly, is to make a practical claim about how this improves the quality of developing nations' institutions. This broadly relies on the long-term benefits to these institutions coming from the West. And though I did have rebuttal, I think closing government did that job for us by knifing them in their member of government, by saying there'll be significantly fewer international students coming to these institutions. So if that's true, then the amount of remittances and payments that these Western institutions give developing countries significantly decreases in the long term. So not only does CG not have a case, but they undermine the entirety of OG case. Then thirdly, on CG, I already very roughly dealt with this in the OG, but they say that this decreases the intake of international students, which benefits the domestic economy. First of all, as I think all of their analysis about how these students can use their expertise at home rather than in the West relies on the assumption that these students already have this expertise. That's not true, because the reason so many students from international students come to wealthy institutions is to get that training and education in the first place. If they're not institutions, no thank you, then they can't possibly use their expertise because it doesn't exist. But second of all, is it just undermines their own case and opening government's case. This is one of the most bizarre impacts I've ever seen in my life. If they're not taking in international students, they can't pay that many remittances and payments to developing institutions, so they can't develop their own economy. CG just undermines themselves and they're out of the debate. But with that, the extension we bring you uniquely in closing opposition is why this massively decreases the institution's incentive to bring in international students specifically from developing countries, those who are the most vulnerable and the ones that need the most help and training education. Two broad points of framing that you should keep in mind when taking in this extension. First of all, is the context that OG sets up in their second argument on accountability. If it's true, somewhat undermines them, because their colonial guilt, or the institution's sense of colonial guilt, is why Western institutions offer a lot of scholarships to students from developing countries, meaning the institutions pay the high cost of the education for the students, which can go upwards of $30,000 every single year. But secondly, is these students from the developing world benefit the developing world significantly when they go to the West. They're regularly accepted to wealthy institutions like Harvard and Stanford every year. They're offered employment opportunities in some of the wealthiest cities in the world, and they can pay remittances to their families that can be used in the economy. But now, however, these institutions have to pay significantly more to offer these vulnerable students actual opportunities because they don't get much in return. It reduces their incentive to bring in those students in the first place, which means fewer of these students come in the long term. And there are four structurally independent reasons as to why the amount of these students will decrease. First of all, is Western and wealthy institutions feel like they're already paying for the improvement of educational institutions in developing countries by paying this proportion of fees. Therefore, there's no reason for them to invest in the opportunities for the students because they're benefiting them at home. Second of all, is it decreases their competitive advantage with other wealthy institutions. Note panel that all these institutions that are wealthy, their capital is dependent on getting students in every single year. And thank you. And the students look at three distinct things. The first is the quality and the quantity of the facilities being offered, like MIT scientific labs. Or B, is the actual look and the quality of the campus, if it's pretty. But thirdly, is just reputation. And that's why these institutions spend a huge amount of money every single year purchasing and renovating large buildings, purchasing equipment and laboratories. Thirdly, is hiring very qualified and expensive professors to teach them. So if one institution which has a high proportion of international students has to pay a huge sum of money to developing countries, that makes it much harder to attract more sponsors, etc. Therefore, the institutions get less money in the long term. This means they'll bring in significantly fewer students from developing countries in the long term, and so the benefits that OG talk about will decrease. Thirdly, is this rising xenophobia in politics, which trickles down to academia. This policy would massively fuel that xenophobia, which in turn will decrease the subsidies that they get from the state. That is how many of these institutions, like public universities in the US, are able to compete quite closely with each other. But this massively changes on the comparative when one institution loses its subsidies because it's taking in so many international students. But fourthly, is that lucky students from developing countries usually receive scholarships or financial assistance like bursaries, but they already pay quite little and they receive the biggest benefits from the education, like opportunities in employment, or they send money back home, or they can even bring their family with them to get more opportunities. But that changes because it becomes incredibly expensive for the institution to bring them in the first place, which will decrease the overall intake of students from the developing countries, especially because they think the developing institutions are improving in the first place. What this means is that the comparative benefit the government offers to these institutions and students is absolutely minimal. The model, as they say, if it's proportional to the payment, means that A, the payment to developing countries is going to be small in the first place, but B, it will decrease in the long term because there are fewer international and developing students in the first place. This might not in itself be a harm, but because fewer developing students from developing countries come in the first place, they can't offer the same benefits and opportunities in the first place. For all those reasons, because we actually benefit or prevent the harm to students from developing countries, vote CO.
Thank the member for their speech and now invite Government Whip.
I thought I just missed my speech because the past 7 minutes have not been an op case. They've not been an op extension. They've merely been a repetition of a case whilst claiming that we didn't have one. Because note, 2 things Maxwell brought you. The first was a realistic frame on why inherently universities are less likely to take international students. MO just spent around 3 minutes telling us why that's true, so I presume they assume that this is not a knife, given their opening also explicitly said that there'll be more international students, whereas OG just didn't mention anything on that front. So if anything, they're the ones knifing, but we are realistic or happy to buy into their frame. But the second part was the actual extension where you brought your content. I don't think MO kind of listened. Because note, we gave you 4 mechanisms as to why fewer international students going abroad actually matter. 1, we told you that there's money in local institutions because instead of spending like 40K a year on Harvard, you're spending like 40K a year on your local schools, and even if you're not spending in tuition, you'll donate it or something. Second, you have lobbying and try to increase gov spending. OO ask us, there's currently limited numbers of engineering spots in local universities. Yes, okay, according to their own characterization of international students as super rich, and given that CO basically proves to us, and we do prove to a large extent, that basically fewer people get in, that means these rich students who have lots of political capital can do things like increase the number of local students, because no longer are they donating like millions to Harvard, they're donating like thousands and millions to their own universities, therefore expanding the market and therefore creating more things. It is immensely elitist to just randomly assume that these universities don't exist, that there's no expertise and that no education can exist. 1, we think it's quite demeaning and probably very racist to assume that they just don't exist in the status quo. 2, assuming that they don't for some reason, we can say that it is not necessarily going to be so in the long term. So yes, now they might be, but once people decide to reinvest money into their own schools, we will create these opportunities and this expertise. I'm pretty sure this works. CF China, CF India, they're getting really great institutions. CF Singapore, we think that these are the places that are rising. Third, we thought that there's emotional connections and knowledge about your own country. And this is really important insofar as the vast majority of the people who stay behind are going to be elites, are going to be the people who are in the upper and middle classes, who are eventually going to be at the top of the bureaucracies, eventually going to be leading the local academia, eventually going to be the people who actually contribute to the economy or have the potential to contribute to the economy. So instead of learning about like Churchill or some other white dude, they actually learn about their own history and their own culture and interact with people from their own communities. Yes, we accept to some degree that these are not going to be like the poorest of the poor or like the average representative person, but they're significantly more local than the average Brit at Oxford. That's a crucial comparative because once you learn more about your own community, you're much better placed to be able to do something about it if you choose to say. And therefore, 4th, the thing that wins us the debate right out, why individuals are significantly more likely to stay behind. 3 reasons. 1, they're actually able to stay because there's no countervailing incentives of big monies at Goldman Sachs waving in your face because you don't have the Oxford degree, which would get you in there in the first place. So you don't have the alternative options, which means that the only option you have is to stay. Second, degrees and qualifications often don't cross-apply. So I would have to take another medical exam or take another degree in like law in order to be able to apply the degree I learned in, say, Korea to the US, which means that you can't just move out. Third, due to xenophobia and structural reasons and general like fear of external people, US, UK, and Canadian universities tend not to like to give people, the countries tend not to like to give people visas. Like I got my visa rejected before before Eton gave me one, and I think that that applies to the vast majority of people, especially when they come from developing countries, etc. This means that structurally you're unlikely to go abroad, which means you have to stay. And once you stay, you work within your country, which means this is the mechanism that solves brain drain. All the three teams. CEO literally had no extension, just told us that there's fewer international students, didn't give us a single harm except these people aren't able to access any education. That's just racist, bro. I think here's like probably the main stuff. But note, two problems. One, the entire case is contingent upon the counterfactual. That is to say, they say our counterpart magically solves all issues with structural racism and like the universities and brain drain, etc. And then the second is why brain drain is kind of like maybe good for some people, but we're not really sure why that is. The first issue and the two issues with their counterprop are one, it is not mutually exclusive. Like the problem of should we reduce caps is completely different. Secondly, it's not equivalent political capital because all of the harms they hypothetically say are to international students, whereas the harms of like removing caps for local students are on, guess what, local students who can actually vote, whereas international students can't. Therefore, they can't just take our political capital and plug it in there because those two political capitals aren't equivalent. I think that that's their case done, but also it's not inherently clear what their harms are because they don't do an awful deal of impacting. They just make statements that are broadly true and assume you to care. We told you why fundamentally we solve brain drain, and that's really good because local institutions and the availability of education to people in the most the vast majority of developing nations increases for the middle and lower classes, which we care significantly more than like the billionaires within these countries who decide to go around and like send their children to Oxford. Before I move on, I'll take over.
It's the same political capital because international students aren't a monolith. The rich students who get attracted by Goldman Sachs will be able to go in either world. It's the middle class international students who can't get into hyper competitive universities like Beijing who are harmed by our case. That's why it's not attention. That's why our closing doesn't knife us and why, CG hasn't.
Well, I'm not really sure why there's like a limit because apparently you're going to take more international students and you need to raise prices, but apparently like you have fewer because like some people get shut out. It was never really clear where the numbers lied. We probably said that in terms of opportunity cost, richer local people are more valuable in terms of general perceptions to these universities than rich foreign people. That's why we win. Okay. Last thing, OG. They basically say that they want to solve things through removing brain drain. But their entire principle is contingent on the practical of actually helping people on the ground, and that's how the universities will fulfill the obligation. Insofar as the only mechanism was we give 10% of a very small number of students within these countries' income and like university fees to another country, that is really low insofar as it's likely to spread out all the structural reasons OO gave. But crucially, ours were more guaranteed, they were more direct, and they were much more concentrated in actual effects. And notice, they're guaranteed to happen on any scale. Therefore, given that their own framing was that brain drain is the one thing you need to solve and the most important consideration in this debate, we win on their own metric, thereby taking this debate as a whole. I'm so proud to stand on the right side of this debate.
Thank the speaker for that speech, and to finish off this debate, I now invite opposition leader.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. 3 questions in the speech. 1, why 3 points actually. 1, why individuals are likely to return to their home country or send back remittances, and that is what is currently already developing these countries in the status quo. 2, why this policy is unlikely to improve the educational systems in developing countries. 3, three, why the OG principle does not match with the motion and literally completely falls out of the debate. I want to make one thing very clear on how we are going to exactly win this debate. What we will prove to you is that the main benefit for developing countries is that they can go to the West and again can go there. And we are also going to explain why if they can no longer go there, that is actually a very big harm. And therefore, there is one crucial link, right? The crucial link in this debate is whether these individuals will stay in the West and therefore not help their own country, or whether they're far more likely to return. I think here, all of CG's mechanisms are incredibly sort of assertive to a certain extent, and I will give you more detail. So what does CG say to this regard? They say you can get better jobs and you sort of have proximity bias and have a higher amount of money in the West, right? Notice that it's not clear why people intrinsically care about that. So just take that into account for later. But two, their impact on xenophobia is literally the main reason why a lot of individuals are likely to return to their home country, right? Probably a job at Goldman Sachs is not going to be very fun when you don't get promotions because you're discriminated against, because you look different, because you speak different, when you constantly have to deal with microaggressions. I actually think that their mechanism is the main reason why most of these people are already just returning to their home country after their university studies, because they feel alienated and don't have a sense of community and support in the Western world. So here are 5 reasons why individuals are likely to return and how that developed the country, and I'll also do some weighing. And I want to know that OO does a little bit of this, but they miss the nuances here. So firstly, often people out from the developing world have particularly strong religious ties and ties to their family. They're from hierarchical, like often these families are very hierarchical and strong family ties, and therefore these type of cultures really value that you support and care about your family in the regards, right? This is like mostly religion, and these things largely exist in the developing world. But that secondly means that I think people will just feel very guilty if you stay in the West, right? Because money isn't everything, Eton. Like, I don't think that is what people will actually care about that much. You never explain that. But third, even if you stay in the West, given that the wages in the West are so high, as you guys yourself say, we think that the remittances that you can now send back to your family are also incredibly high. This is the nuance that sort of DLO misses when he quickly talks about remittances in one line. But fourthly, as they concede, getting asylum in the West is incredibly difficult. So often you can study there, but it's far harder to actually get an asylum and live there for your entire life, specifically like with all the populism we're seeing right now. So I think it's often likely that people actually return. So now, with this in mind, 2 points of weighing. First, remittances are a direct benefit, right? These remittances are a lot of money that is going to flow into the local economy and it will trickle down, which means people just have more purchasing power. Compare this to the CG case and OG case, which CG case relies on two things. One, it relies on people still having a very good education in their home country, which I'm just about to disprove later. But two, it relies on a sort of they never explain how you having a better education will lead to development, right? Like how will this actually mean that people get better jobs? How will this actually mean that people get better healthcare? I don't know. We have a direct benefit. But two, on the way off, the people that return on our side of the house will be far more skilled, right? These are people that literally went to the best, to like good Western universities. So they are more skilled than the people that you train on your home. I'll quickly take, so I think for all those reasons, CG is out. I'll now take OG.
You need to engage with the preemption that Mahad originally gave you in his speech. Institutions don't solely exist as profit-making machines. Why is it likely that these institutions are still not going to take international students, given that they care about prestige and care about demographics, even without the motivation of profit?
So we're never going to say, like, this is the complete thing, right? Currently, they're actually often taking the students in by giving them free scholarships, like free tuition fees. So someone from Ghana is unlikely to ever pay a high tuition fee, so they're actually giving like ones free out. They're far less likely to do that on your side of the house. And also, I think here is what Igor analyzes, right? You say they're not profit machines, but actually they kind of are to a certain extent, right? Because the amount of students that they get, and like the smart, they want to get the best students, and the amount of students that they get is dependent on how well their university is doing, right? So I do think that for a large extent, they're not as morally sort of always doing the morally right thing. Actually, your own principle sort of paints these universities at not being morally right and good, right? So you fail in that regard. Now, let's deal with another thing. Second question, why this policy is not going to like completely improve the quality of these systems. Two things here. One, many developing countries and the governments of these countries are largely authoritarian or far like weaker democracies. I think often these governments have actual incentives not to invest too much in education or like the elite educated universities within their institution in the first place. Why is that? For example, in Indonesia, when people got like very smart and very like well developed, that far more threatened sort of the Dutch regime, the Dutch regime and rulings back then, right? Because people got far more well educated to run for politics. But two, and I think this is the most nuanced reason, currently, insofar as governments are now spending funding to these local universities, they're far less likely to do it on the other side of the house, because now they have a rhetoric of saying, well, the Western universities are already funding our universities. So now, and that's where I think a lot of these governments are far more likely to just retract their own funding and spend on other type of legacy projects like airports, right? Because they feel like the funding is already covered. That means these institutions, the quality of the institution is somewhat symmetric on the both sides. Then OG's principle. I have one large response, because I completely agree. It is a morally right thing to do, right? It would be a good thing to send this funding. However, they're not specific to the motion. We think the reason why it's illegitimate is because the burden is not like linked to how many international institutions are taking. Like literally, like two things here. One, a lot of institutions also have international students from other Western countries. Like I don't see why Oxford taking in some Dutch university students means that they owe a specific obligation. But two, a lot of countries like the US, like Harvard and stuff, they didn't partake in colonialism, so therefore that also falls. Proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech, and I thank everyone for this debate. I request all observers and debaters to now leave the room so that we may deliberate.
Thank you for the debate, everyone.
Thank you.